I've always thought of State of Decay as being by far the weakest of the E-Space trilogy. But watching it now, it turns out it's not bad at all. It's just a solid old-fashioned Doctor Who story with a distinctly spooky atmosphere, and it provides a nice change of pace between the more experimental stories on either side. It feels very much like a story from the Philip Hinchcliffe era, with the atmosphere on horror rather than humour or scientific technobabble. There's a very traditional setup, with a village full of peasants ruled over by evil vampires who harvest them for their blood. And it looks and feels very much like a classic Hammer horror movie. But the twist that they're all survivors of a spaceship crash takes it into a new dimension, although it is very familiar to anyone who's watched the previous story. The atmosphere throughout is nicely chilling, with elaborate gothic sets, moody synthesizer soundtrack, and fog-shrouded forests all combining to set the scene. The cliffhangers are sadly not the best. Episode 1 ends with the Doctor and Romana being attacked by a flock of unconvincing bats, and episode 2 just ends on a close-up of Orcon's face, which in itself is not that scary. And the depiction of the great vampire is distinctly underwhelming. He's been built up throughout the story, but in the end all we see of him is just the one hand, reaching out of the earth and then going back in again. Anything more would probably have been just as disappointing, but they could have made the effort. Perhaps the new series could bring back the Great One, or another of his race. Modern effects would certainly be up to the task of showing vampires the size of planets, having spaceships rammed into their hearts. And the whole backstory of ancient Time Lords fighting vampires is certainly ripe for further exploration. This was the first story that Matthew Waterhouse filmed as Adric, and he comes across very differently than he did in Full Circle. Here the character is meant to be more of a sly, cunning rascal who tries to talk his way out of every situation. He's still not very good, but at least the character has a personality here, and isn't just whining all the time. And if they tried to keep his characterisation along these lines, then who knows, he may have grown into the part. It's still hilarious that the Doctor and Romana clearly have no sympathy for him, and they very much resent having to save him from the vampires. And it would have made for a much more refreshing Doctor-companion relationship had they kept it going like this, with the Doctor barely tolerating Adric's presence, but forced to keep him in the TARDIS because he's got nowhere else to go. The Doctor and Romana spend a lot of time together in this story, and their chemistry shines through, even though Tom Baker and Lalla were allegedly not speaking at the time of recording. I don't think they spend so much time together in the next story, but this one showcases their relationship at its best one last time. Of the guest actors, there are a lot to choose from, with an inn full of villagers at the start, a cave full of rebels looking at screens from teletext, and a tower full of guards. To be honest, none of them really stand out. It's the vampires who get the most to do. Rachel Davies and William Lindsay are suitably seductive when they're trying to convert Adric and Romana, but their performances are a bit mannered and theatrical, and they never really come across as three-dimensional characters. Emrys James as the vampire priest Orcon is by far the most convincing. He's clearly having a lot of fun in the role, but he never goes completely over the top, like the others do. The DVD has nearly an hour of special features. The Vampire Lovers is sadly not the movie, but a 20-minute making-of documentary. Terrance Dicks talks about his fractious relationship with Christopher Bidmead, which is becoming a bit of a theme among all the writers that Bidmead worked with. And we also hear from the director and a couple of the actors. There's 5 minutes of footage from the visual effects sequences, when they were recording The Tower in the Hand. A 17-minute feature where horror writers talk about the history of vampires in fiction, from Bram Stoker through to Anne Rice, which is pretty interesting. There's also a 10-minute documentary about blood for some reason, featuring some very strange characters who you would not want to meet in real life. And it has to be one of the weirdest extras ever commissioned for one of these DVDs. Finally, we get 4 minutes of cultural historian Sir Christopher Frayling giving his take on State of Decay, which isn't really interesting enough to be given its own feature. Overall, it's got a great atmosphere, but the ending is a bit of an anticlimax, so I'll give it 7. Next week, Warrior's Gate, one of the weirdest of all Doctor Who stories. Subscribe to find out if I can make some sense of it, and I'll see you next time.